I am Rebecca Martinez, and I still remember the exact moment the crystal wine glass shattered against the restaurant's marble floor. The sound cut through the elegant dining room of Meridian like a gunshot, silencing conversations at every table. My husband David sat frozen across from me, his anniversary gift still unwrapped beside the flickering candles, as my brother Kyle stumbled through the entrance with that familiar wild look in his bloodshot eyes.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Where's my loving sister?" he bellowed, his voice slurred and dangerous. Celebrating without inviting family? 23 tables of distinguished diners turned to stare as Kyle weaved between servers, his unwashed flannel shirt and torn jeans a stark contrast to the restaurant's refined atmosphere. The maitre d', Vincent, approached him with practiced diplomacy, but Kyle shoved past him with enough force to send the elderly man stumbling backward into a decorative plant. "Sir, please," Vincent tried again, his French accent thick with tension. "This is a private establishment." "Private?" Kyle's laugh was harsh and mocking. "My sister thinks she's too good for the family now. Sits here in her fancy dress, pretending she didn't grow up in the same trailer park I did." The humiliation burned through my chest as every eye in the restaurant focused on our table. David reached for my hand, but I pulled away, my body rigid with a mixture of rage and mortification. This was supposed to be our night. 5 years of marriage, and Kyle had managed to destroy another milestone moment. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Vincent, instead of simply asking Kyle to leave, discreetly signaled to the hostess. Within seconds, she had disappeared toward the back of the restaurant. I caught the subtle exchange and realized with growing amazement that Vincent wasn't just going to handle this diplomatically. He was calling the police, without even waiting to see how far Kyle would escalate. The manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Lawson, emerged from the kitchen area. She moved with the confidence of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before, her black dress and silver jewelry projecting authority as she approached our table. But she didn't speak to Kyle first. She came directly to me. "Mrs. Martinez," she said quietly, leaning down so only David and I could hear, "we've had situations with your brother before. Would you prefer to move to our private dining room while we handle this?" The words hit me like ice water. They knew. Somehow, this restaurant had records of Kyle's previous disruptions. The realization that my brother's behavior had reached the point where establishments were taking preemptive action was both mortifying and, strangely, validating. Kyle, meanwhile, had noticed the staff's coordinated response. His face darkened with the rage I knew so well from childhood, the expression that preceded his most destructive episodes. "Don't you dare call anyone," he snarled at Vincent, grabbing the maitre d's arm with enough force to leave marks. "This is between me and my sister." "Actually, sir," Patricia interjected, stepping between Kyle and Vincent with remarkable composure, "this became our business the moment you put your hands on our staff member." The dining room had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen sounds seemed muted, as everyone waited to see how this confrontation would unfold. David stood slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow over our table as he positioned himself slightly in front of me. "Kyle," he said, his voice steady but firm, "this is our anniversary dinner. Rebecca planned this for weeks. You're not going to ruin it." Kyle's face contorted with familiar fury. "Ruin it? I'm family, real family, not some suit she married to forget where she came from." The accusation stung, because it contained just enough truth to wound. I had worked hard to distance myself from the chaos of my childhood, from the constant drama and crisis that followed Kyle wherever he went. But seeing him now, disheveled and desperate in this beautiful restaurant, I felt the familiar guilt that had controlled me for years. That's when I heard the sirens. Patricia had been more efficient than I had realized. The police were already outside, their red and blue lights painting the restaurant's windows in alternating colors. Kyle heard them too, his head snapping toward the entrance as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his alcohol-fueled bravado.
You called the cops on me? His voice carried genuine shock, as if the concept of facing consequences for his actions was foreign to him. Rebecca, tell them this is a misunderstanding.
But I didn't say anything. For the first time in my 32 years, I sat in silence while authorities approached to deal with Kyle's behavior. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it was something else: relief. 2 officers entered Meridian with the confident bearing of professionals accustomed to de-escalating volatile situations. The taller one, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, assessed the scene quickly before approaching our table. "Evening, folks. We received a call about a disturbance." Kyle's demeanor shifted immediately, the aggressive posture melting into the familiar mask of injured innocence he'd perfected over the years. "Officers, this is just a family disagreement. My sister and I were having a conversation." A conversation that involved putting hands on restaurant staff? The second officer, a younger man with a stern expression, asked Patricia directly. "He grabbed my maitre d's' arm," Patricia confirmed without hesitation. "We have several witnesses and our security cameras captured the incident." The words "security cameras" seemed to drain the color from Kyle's face. Whatever story he'd been preparing to tell was useless against video evidence. I watched as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his altered state. "Rebecca," he pleaded, turning to me with the desperate expression I knew so well. "Come on, tell them this is blown out of proportion. I just wanted to talk to you." David's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. The gesture reminded me that I wasn't alone in this moment, that I had someone who would support whatever decision I made. For years, I had been Kyle's safety net, the person who made excuses, who minimized his behavior, who sacrificed my own peace to manage his chaos. But sitting in that restaurant, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed my humiliation, something fundamental shifted inside me. The embarrassment was crushing, but the determination growing beneath it was stronger. "Officer," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "my brother has been struggling with addiction for several years. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my wedding anniversary, and he showed up uninvited and intoxicated." Kyle's face went white. In all our years of dysfunction, I had never spoken so directly about his problems to authority figures. I had always been the one to smooth things over, to provide alibis, to enable his destructive patterns by shielding him from consequences. "Ma'am," the female officer said gently, "has he threatened you or your husband tonight?" I looked at Kyle, seeing not the menacing figure he'd appeared to be moments earlier, but the broken man he'd become. The brother who had once taught me to ride a bike and defended me from schoolyard bullies was barely visible beneath years of poor choices and substance abuse. "Not directly," I admitted, "but his presence here, the way he's behaving, it's part of a long pattern." The officers exchanged a meaningful look before the younger one addressed Kyle directly. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. The restaurant staff is willing to press charges for assault, and you're clearly under the influence." As they placed Kyle in handcuffs, he looked back at me with an expression of such profound betrayal that it nearly broke my resolve. "Becca, how could you do this to me? I'm your brother!" But I remained silent, watching as they led him away. The restaurant gradually returned to its normal rhythm, conversations resuming in hushed tones as servers discreetly cleaned up the broken glass and reset tables. Patricia approached us again, her expression compassionate but professional. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that you and your husband are welcome to stay and complete your dinner. There's no charge for tonight's meal, and we'd be honored to help you salvage your anniversary celebration." David squeezed my hand again, his eyes asking the question he was too considerate to voice aloud. Did I want to stay? Could I possibly enjoy the rest of our evening after everything that had happened? Looking around the restaurant,
I realized that while the other diners had witnessed my family's dysfunction, they had also seen something else. They had seen a woman who finally refused to enable destructive behavior. They had seen someone choose her marriage and her own peace over familiar patterns of dysfunction. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Growing up in Pine Valley Mobile Home Park taught me that love and chaos often lived in the same small spaces. Our double-wide trailer sat on lot 47, distinguished from the others only by the garden my mother Carmen tended with religious devotion. Despite our circumstances, she filled every available inch with tomatoes, peppers, and marigolds, creating beauty where others saw only poverty. Kyle was 3 years older than I was, and in those early years, he was my hero. When I was 6 and he was 9, he spent an entire summer teaching me to ride the rusty bicycle he'd found at the county dump. He ran alongside me for hours in the blistering Arizona heat, his hand steady on the seat back, promising he wouldn't let go until I was ready.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "You got this, Becca," he would say, his voice full of pride when I finally pedaled those first wobbly yards alone. "You're tougher than you know." Our father, Miguel, worked construction when the jobs were available, which wasn't often enough. The boom and bust cycle of the Phoenix housing market meant months of steady work, followed by long stretches of uncertainty. During the lean times, he'd disappear for days, supposedly looking for work in Tucson or Flagstaff, but always returning with the smell of alcohol and disappointment clinging to his clothes. Carmen held our family together through sheer force of will. She cleaned houses for wealthy families in Scottsdale, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, her hands cracked from chemicals and her back aching from bending over bathtubs and toilets all day. But she never complained, not once, in my presence. "Education is our way out," she would tell Kyle and me every night as she helped us with homework at the small kitchen table. "Promise me you'll both graduate high school. Promise me you'll be better than this place." Kyle and I promised easily then, believing as children do that good intentions were enough to guarantee good outcomes. We were going to escape Pine Valley together, maybe go to college, definitely have better lives than our parents. The first cracks in Kyle's facade appeared when he turned 14. He started hanging around with Tommy Valdez and his crew, older boys who had already dropped out of school and spent their days skateboarding behind the Circle K and their nights getting into trouble I was too young to understand. Kyle would come home with new clothes he claimed to have found, electronics that had mysteriously appeared in his backpack, and stories that never quite added up. "Where did this come from?" Carmen would ask, holding up an expensive-looking watch or a brand-name jacket. "Tommy's cousin works at the mall," Kyle would say, or "someone was throwing it away," or "I traded my old skateboard for it." Carmen wanted to believe him. We all did. It was easier than confronting the possibility that Kyle was stealing. Easier than admitting that Pine Valley's gravity was already pulling him down. I was 12 when I first saw Kyle high. I'd gotten up for a glass of water and found him sitting on our tiny front porch staring at the stars with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, and when I called his name, it took him several seconds to turn his head toward me. "Hey, little sister," he said, his voice thick and strange. "Look at all those stars. You ever notice how they move if you watch them long enough?" I sat beside him, following his gaze upward. The stars looked perfectly still to me, fixed points of light in the desert sky. But Kyle kept pointing at them, describing patterns and movements that existed only in his altered perception. "Kyle, are you okay?" He laughed, a sound that was both happy and hollow. "I'm great, Becca. Everything's so much better when you can't feel it all pressing down on you." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I filed the conversation away in the part of my mind where I stored things that worried me about my brother. The list was growing longer. By the time Kyle turned 16, the pretense had largely disappeared. He stopped attending school regularly, earning himself a spot in the truancy officer's frequent rotation through Pine Valley. Carmen would get calls from the school, from store security, from other parents whose children had been caught with Kyle during various misdeeds. "I don't understand," she would cry after hanging up from yet another disciplinary conference. "He's a good boy. He just needs to find his way." But Kyle wasn't lost. He was running away from expectations and responsibilities and anything that reminded him of the limitations of our life in Pine Valley. The harder Carmen tried to reel him back in, the more desperately he fought against her efforts. Meanwhile, I threw myself into academics with the fervor of someone who had seen what happened when you didn't have a plan. My grades were perfect, my attendance was flawless, and my teachers began talking about scholarships and college applications. Carmen would beam with pride when she attended parent-teacher conferences about my progress, but I noticed the way her smile faltered when the conversation inevitably turned to Kyle. "Your daughter has real potential," Mrs. Rodriguez told Carmen during my sophomore year. "She could go anywhere with grades like these. Arizona State has some excellent programs, and with her test scores, she might even qualify for out-of-state opportunities." Carmen nodded enthusiastically, but I saw her glance towards the parking lot where Kyle was supposed to be waiting for us that evening. He'd promised to drive us to the school that evening, but his car was nowhere to be seen. We ended up walking the 3 miles home in the dark, Carmen never complaining, but her disappointment was palpable in the silence between us.
The breaking point came during my junior year. Kyle, now 18 and legally an adult, had been arrested for possession with intent to distribute. Not marijuana, as I'd hoped during my most optimistic moments, but methamphetamine. The call came at 2 in the morning, Carmen's phone buzzing insistently until she stumbled from her bedroom to answer it. I listened from my bed as she spoke in rapid Spanish to whoever was on the other end, her voice climbing higher with each exchange. When she finally hung up, I heard her sink into the kitchen chair and begin to cry with a depth of grief I'd never heard from her before. "Mija," she said when I appeared in the doorway, "your brother needs help." We drove to the county jail in Carmen's ancient Honda, the radio broken and the air conditioning wheezing ineffectively against the desert heat. Kyle looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, younger somehow, despite the hard lines that drugs and poor choices had carved around his eyes. "It's not as bad as it sounds," he told us through the thick glass partition. "The lawyer says if I plead guilty, I'll only get 18 months, maybe less with good behavior." Carmen pressed her palm against the glass, tears streaming down her face. "How did this happen, mijo? How did we get here?" Kyle's expression hardened. "We were born here, Ma. Some of us just stopped pretending we're going to escape." The words hit me like a physical blow. Kyle wasn't just rejecting help or refusing responsibility. He was rejecting hope itself, surrendering to the belief that Pine Valley's limitations were permanent and inescapable. That night, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I was going to prove Kyle wrong. I was going to escape Pine Valley not through drugs or crime or self-destruction, but through the path Carmen had always shown us. Education, hard work, and refusing to accept that your circumstances had to define your future. I studied harder, worked part-time jobs to save money for college applications, and applied for every scholarship I could find. When acceptance letters began arriving during my senior year, I felt vindicated in a way that was both triumphant and heartbreaking. I was going to Arizona State University on a full academic scholarship, but Kyle was going to serve his time in state prison. Carmen was proud, but conflicted about my success. "You're going to do wonderful things," she told me the night before I left for college. "But don't forget about your brother. Don't give up on him completely." I promised I wouldn't, but part of me wondered if Kyle had already given up on himself. Prison might rehabilitate him, I told myself. Maybe hitting rock bottom would motivate him to change. I was wrong about almost everything. College opened doors I hadn't even known existed. My professors encouraged my interest in social work, seeing potential in my understanding of addiction and family dysfunction. "You have insights that come from lived experience," Dr. Patricia Henley, my advisor, told me. "That's invaluable in this field." I threw myself into my studies, majoring in social work with a focus on addiction counseling. Every class, every internship, every research project was preparation for the day when I could help people like Kyle
find their way back from the edge. But Kyle's letters from prison grew increasingly bitter and disconnected from reality. He wrote about other inmates who'd been wrongly convicted, about corrupt guards and unfair treatment, about everything except taking responsibility for the choices that had landed him there. When he was released after serving 14 months, he came home angry and convinced that the world owed him something. That's when the real pattern began. Kyle would get clean for a few weeks or months, find a job, and begin to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. Carmen and I would allow ourselves to hope, to believe that this time would be different. Then something would trigger him. Stress, disappointment, or simply the accumulated weight of trying to live clean, and he would disappear into another spiral of drugs and destructive behavior. Each cycle left our family more fractured and exhausted. Carmen aged years in months, the stress of Kyle's addiction stealing her health and her peace. I found myself becoming his unofficial case manager, the person who made excuses to employers, who bailed him out of jail, who cleaned up the messes he left in his wake. The pattern followed me even after I graduated and started working as a counselor at Desert Hope Treatment Center. I understood addiction intellectually, could help other families navigate the chaos and heartbreak of loving someone who couldn't stay clean. But when it came to Kyle, all my professional training evaporated. He was my brother, and I couldn't maintain the boundaries that I knew were essential for recovery. Meeting David changed everything, though it took me years to realize how much. He was a high school math teacher, patient and kind, who didn't run when I explained my family situation on our third date. Instead, he listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions about my work and my hopes for Kyle's recovery. "You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved," he said gently, after I'd described Kyle's latest relapse. "But you can decide how much of your own life you're willing to sacrifice in the attempt." The wisdom in his words was both obvious and revolutionary. I'd spent so many years defining myself in relation to Kyle's problems that I'd forgotten I had a right to my own happiness, my own goals, my own peaceful life.
My wedding day to David was the first major life event where Kyle's presence was uncertain until the very last moment. I had sent him an invitation, of course, but 3 weeks before the ceremony, he was living in a halfway house in Tempe after his second stint in county jail for drug possession. Carmen and I visited him there on a sweltering Thursday afternoon, the building's broken air conditioning making the common room feel like an oven. "I want to be there for you, Becca," Kyle said, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "I know I've missed a lot of important stuff, but your wedding, that's different." He looked better than he had in months, the structure of the halfway house providing the external discipline he couldn't seem to generate internally. His eyes were clear, his clothes were clean, and he'd gained back some of the weight that drugs had stripped from his frame. But I'd learned not to trust appearances when it came to Kyle's recovery. "The ceremony is at 2:00, I told him, choosing my words carefully. "David and I would love to have you there, but only if you're ready. Only if you can handle being around people drinking champagne without it triggering anything." Kyle's face darkened slightly at the implication, but he nodded. "I'll be there. I promise." Carmen squeezed my hand under the table. After years of broken promises and shattered expectations, we both wanted to believe him, but neither of us was willing to build our hopes too high. The morning of my wedding, I woke up in the hotel room I was sharing with my maid of honor, Jessica Chen, a colleague from Desert Hope who had become my closest friend. She was already up, steam from the shower fogging the bathroom mirror, and she poked her head out when she heard me stirring. "Big day," she said with a grin. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous about everything except marrying David," I admitted, checking my phone for messages. Nothing from Kyle, which could mean anything. The ceremony was being held at Papago Park, under a ramada overlooking the red sandstone formations that made Phoenix unique among major cities. David and I had chosen the location because it was beautiful and affordable, but also because the outdoor setting felt more authentic than a traditional church or hotel ballroom. As guests began arriving, I found myself scanning the crowd from the bridal suite's window, looking for Kyle's familiar figure. Carmen had saved him a seat in the front row, an optimistic gesture that made my heart ache with love for her persistent faith in her son. At 1:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Kyle appeared at the edge of the parking area. He was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, probably borrowed from someone at the halfway house, and his hair was neatly combed. But what struck me most was his posture. He stood uncertainly at the perimeter of the gathering, like someone who wasn't sure he belonged. "Go," Jessica said, noticing where my attention was focused. "Talk to him. I'll handle things here." I slipped out the back entrance of the building and approached Kyle slowly, my wedding dress rustling against the desert plants that lined the walkway. When he saw me coming, his face lit up with genuine joy mixed with something that looked like relief. "You look beautiful, little sister," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "like a princess or something." "You came," I said simply, and he nodded. "Told you I would. I know I've broken a lot of promises, but not this one." We stood there for a moment, my wedding dress stark white against the red rocks behind us, Kyle looking more like himself than he had in years. For just that moment, I could see the brother who had taught me to ride a bike, who had defended me from bullies, who had once been my hero. "I'm proud of you, Becca," he continued. "David's a good guy. He makes you happy, and that's all I ever wanted for you." The ceremony was perfect. Kyle sat in the front row between Carmen and my Aunt Rosa, and he didn't fidget or look uncomfortable. He applauded when David and I kissed, he smiled during the vows, and he even laughed at the right moments during the officiant's remarks about marriage being a partnership that requires patience and forgiveness. The reception was held at a community center nearby, nothing fancy, but decorated with lights and flowers that Jessica and Carmen had spent weeks arranging. Kyle nursed a single Coca-Cola throughout the evening, declining offers of champagne from well-meaning relatives who didn't know about his struggles with addiction. "Your brother seems to be doing really well," David's mother, Linda, commented, as we watched Kyle talking animatedly with some of David's cousins. "He's been nothing but charming all evening." I wanted to share her optimism, but I'd learned to view Kyle's good periods as temporary reprieves rather than permanent changes. Still, seeing him laughing and socializing like a normal person, I allowed myself to hope that maybe this time would be different.
The warning signs began appearing about 2 months after the wedding. Kyle had moved out of the halfway house into a studio apartment near downtown Phoenix, a transition that his counselor had recommended as the next step in his recovery. He'd found a job as a stock clerk at a warehouse, nothing glamorous, but steady work with decent pay. For the first few weeks, everything seemed positive. Kyle would call me every few days to update me on his progress, telling me about his coworkers or asking for advice about apartment furnishing. David and I even had him over for dinner twice, and both evenings went smoothly. But gradually, the calls became less frequent and more erratic. When Kyle did call, he sounded either euphoric about minor successes or despondent about small setbacks. There was no middle ground, no emotional stability. "The manager at work has it out for me," he told me during one late-night call. "He's looking for reasons to fire me, I can tell. He gives me all the worst assignments and then criticizes how I do them." "What kind of assignments?" I asked, trying to determine whether Kyle's perception was accurate or distorted by paranoia. "Loading trucks mostly, but he times me, Becca, like with a stopwatch. None of the other guys get timed." I made encouraging noises and suggested that maybe the manager was just trying to help Kyle improve his efficiency. But I could hear the familiar edge creeping into his voice, the edge that usually preceded a relapse. 3 weeks later, Kyle stopped answering his phone entirely. Carmen and I drove to his apartment on a Saturday morning, knocking repeatedly on his door until the neighbor across the hall informed us that she hadn't seen him in several days. "But I've been hearing music," she added. "Loud music at weird hours and people coming and going at all times of night." Carmen and I exchanged worried glances. We both knew what "people coming and going at all times of night" usually meant in Kyle's world. The apartment manager let us in after Carmen explained that Kyle was her son and she was concerned about his welfare. The studio was in chaos. Empty beer bottles and fast food containers covered every surface. Clothes were scattered across the floor, and the air smelled of stale smoke and something chemical I didn't want to identify. Kyle was passed out on the futon that served as his bed, fully clothed and surrounded by evidence of a multi-day binge. Carmen shook him gently until he stirred, his eyes unfocused and bloodshot when he finally opened them. "Ma, what are you doing here?" "We were worried," Carmen said, her voice carefully controlled. "You haven't been answering your phone." Kyle looked around the apartment as if seeing the mess for the first time, his face registering confusion and then shame. "I lost my job," he said quietly. "Last Monday, the manager said I was unreliable." "And this is how you handled it?" I asked, gesturing to the chaos around us. Kyle's expression hardened, the shame instantly replaced by defensive anger. "Don't lecture me, Rebecca. You don't understand what it's like." But I did understand, at least intellectually. I'd counseled dozens of people through similar relapses, helped families navigate the cycle of hope and disappointment that defined life with an addicted loved one. The difference was that professional training and emotional detachment were impossible when the person destroying their life was your brother. David found me crying in our kitchen that evening, the stress of the day finally overwhelming my attempts to stay strong. He held me while I sobbed out my frustration and fear, my anger at Kyle for throwing away another chance, and my guilt for feeling angry at someone who was sick. "We can't keep doing this," David said gently when my tears had subsided. "Every time Kyle relapses, it takes a piece of you with him. You're going to burn out completely if you don't set some boundaries." "He's my brother," I said, the words automatic after years of using them to justify my enabling behavior. "And I'm your husband," David replied, not unkindly but firmly. "Kyle's addiction doesn't control our entire marriage." The conversation was a turning point, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. David wasn't asking me to abandon Kyle, but he was asking me to consider what I was willing to sacrifice for someone who seemed determined to destroy himself. Over the following months, Kyle went through another rehab program, funded largely by Carmen's retirement savings and a second mortgage on her trailer. He completed the 30-day program successfully and emerged with the same promises and good intentions that had preceded every previous attempt at sobriety. This time, though, I approached his recovery differently. Instead of becoming his unpaid case manager, I maintained more distance. I didn't take his daily check-in calls, I didn't research job opportunities for him, and I didn't immediately offer financial assistance when he claimed to be struggling.
"You're being cold," Carmen accused me after I declined to co-sign a lease for Kyle's new apartment. "I'm being healthy," I replied, using language I'd learned in the Al-Anon meetings David had convinced me to attend. Kyle needs to build his own recovery, not have me build it for him. For a while, the new approach seemed to be working. Kyle found his own apartment, got his own job, and managed his own responsibilities without constant intervention from family members. He seemed more confident and mature, more like the person he could be when he wasn't hiding behind excuses and other people's assistance. But success bred complacency, and complacency bred carelessness. Kyle began skipping his Narcotics Anonymous meetings, claiming he didn't need them anymore. He started hanging out with friends who weren't in recovery, insisting he could handle being around people who drank and used drugs recreationally. "I'm not like them," he told me during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "I can control myself now. I know what triggers me and how to avoid problems." The confidence in his voice was both encouraging and terrifying. Every addiction counselor knows that overconfidence is often the last stop before relapse. But pointing that out to Kyle would only make him more defensive and secretive. So I waited, hoping I was wrong, but preparing myself for the inevitable call that would signal the beginning of another cycle. When it came, 3 months later, I was working late at Desert Hope when my phone rang. "Rebecca?" Kyle's voice was slurred and panicked. "I need help. I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "I got arrested. DUI and possession. They're going to revoke my probation from the last time. I could go to prison for real this time." The familiar weight of Kyle's crisis settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. But this time, instead of immediately springing into action to fix his problems, I took a deep breath and made a decision that would have been impossible just a year earlier. Kyle, I'm sorry this happened, but I can't bail you out anymore. You need to call a lawyer and figure this out yourself. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Kyle's voice returned, filled with disbelief and rage. You're gonna let me go to prison? Your own brother? I'm going to let you face the consequences of your choices, because that's the only way you're ever going to get serious about recovery. The conversation ended with Kyle hanging up on me, but I knew it was the right decision. David found me sitting in my car in the Desert Hope parking lot an hour later, staring at my phone and second-guessing everything. How do you feel? He asked, sliding into the passenger seat. Terrible, I admitted, and relieved, and guilty about feeling relieved. That sounds about right, David said, taking my hand. Change is hard, even when it's necessary. As we drove home through the Phoenix evening, I realized that I was finally beginning to understand the difference between helping and enabling, between love and codependency. It was a lesson I'd taught other families countless times, but learning it personally was proving to be far more difficult and painful than I had ever imagined. Kyle's 18-month prison sentence for violating probation marked the beginning of the most peaceful period my family had experienced in years. Without the constant crisis management that Kyle's addiction demanded, Carmen began to look healthier, sleeping through the night for the first time in decades. David and I settled into married life without the perpetual undercurrent of anxiety that had defined my previous relationships. I threw myself into my work at Desert Hope with renewed energy, helping other families navigate the chaos I knew so intimately. Dr. Sarah Williamson, the clinical director, noticed the change in my approach during our monthly supervision meetings. You seem more centered lately, she observed as we reviewed my caseload. I've been learning about boundaries, I admitted, both professionally and personally. The truth was more complex than that simple statement suggested. With Kyle safely contained in the state correctional system, I was finally able to apply the therapeutic principles I'd been teaching to my own life. The Al-Anon meetings David had convinced me to attend became a lifeline, connecting me with other people who understood the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone who is actively destroying themselves. Margaret Foster, a retired teacher whose son had struggled with heroin addiction for 15 years, became my sponsor in the program. During our weekly coffee meetings at a quiet cafe near her house, she helped me understand concepts that had seemed impossible when Kyle was in active addiction.
Detachment doesn't mean you stop loving them, Margaret explained during one particularly difficult session. It means you stop allowing their chaos to determine your emotional state. The principle sounded simple, but practicing it required constant vigilance. Even with Kyle in prison, I found myself checking the Department of Corrections website obsessively, monitoring his disciplinary record and projected release date. When he was written up for fighting with another inmate, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety form in my stomach, followed immediately by guilt for caring about his choices when I was supposed to be detaching. Carmen struggled more with the concept of healthy boundaries. Kyle's letters from prison painted him as a victim of circumstance, wrongly punished for minor infractions by guards who had singled him out for harassment. She would read these letters aloud to me during our weekly dinners, her voice thick with sympathy for his plight. He says they put him in solitary for 3 days because his cellmate was caught with contraband, she told me one evening, waving Kyle's latest letter. That's not fair. How is Kyle supposed to control what other people do? Ma, I said gently, Kyle's been in prison for 8 months. Do you really think every problem he's had has been someone else's fault? Carmen's face tightened with the defensive expression I'd come to recognize whenever anyone suggested that Kyle might bear responsibility for his circumstances. "You've become hard, Mija. Marriage has changed you." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to wound. Marriage had changed me, but not in the way Carmen meant. David's unwavering support had given me the emotional stability to finally examine my family's dysfunction with clear eyes. For the first time in my adult life, I had someone who put my well-being first, who didn't expect me to sacrifice my peace for someone else's crisis. As Kyle's release date approached, the familiar tension began building in our family. Carmen started making plans for his homecoming, talking about job opportunities and housing options, as if Kyle's previous failures had been temporary setbacks rather than part of a consistent pattern. "He's different now," she insisted when I expressed skepticism about her optimistic projections. "Prison has given him time to think, to mature. He's learned his lesson." I wanted to share her hope, but my professional experience had taught me that prison rarely rehabilitates addicts who haven't committed to recovery. Most inmates simply learn to be more careful about getting caught, not to address the underlying issues that drive their destructive behavior. Kyle's letters to me during his final months of incarceration were filled with promises and plans that sounded familiar, despite his claims of transformation. He was going to get clean and stay clean this time. He was going to find a good job and rebuild his relationship with the family. He was going to prove that he could be the brother I deserved. I know I've said all this before, but I mean it this time. I've had 18 months to think about what I want my life to look like, and it doesn't include drugs or crime or disappointing the people I love. The sincerity in his words was both touching and heartbreaking. I'd heard variations of the same promises after every previous stint in rehab or jail, always delivered with the same earnest conviction. Kyle genuinely believed he was going to change, right up until the moment he encountered his first real test. David and I had been married for almost 3 years when Kyle was released from prison. We'd bought a small house in Tempe, close enough to Desert Hope for an easy commute, but far enough from Pine Valley to feel like we'd created our own space. The house had a guest room, and Carmen hinted repeatedly that Kyle might need somewhere to stay while he got back on his feet. "Just temporarily," she said during one of our Tuesday evening dinners, "until he finds his own place." "No," I said firmly, the word emerging before I could second-guess myself. "Kyle can't stay with us." Carmen's face fell with disappointment. "But he's family, Rebecca. He needs support." "He needs to build his own support system," I replied, drawing on language I'd learned in Al-Anon. "David and I are willing to be part of his recovery, but we can't be responsible for managing it." The conversation ended with Carmen leaving earlier than usual, her disappointment palpable as she gathered her purse and kissed me goodbye. David found me standing at the kitchen sink an hour later, washing dishes with more vigor than necessary. "You did the right thing," he said quietly, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Then why do I feel like such a terrible sister?" "Because changing patterns that have existed your whole life is hard work. But Kyle's recovery has to be his responsibility, not yours." Kyle was released on a Thursday morning in early March. Carmen picked him up from the prison complex in Florence, a 2-hour drive south of Phoenix through desert landscape that looked like the surface of Mars. They stopped at a Denny's for breakfast on the way home, and Carmen texted me a photo of Kyle smiling over a plate of pancakes, looking younger and healthier than I had seen him in years. For the first few weeks, Kyle's behaviors supported Carmen's optimistic predictions. He moved into a halfway house in central Phoenix, found a job washing dishes at a restaurant downtown, and attended Narcotics Anonymous meetings every evening. He called me twice a week to update me on his progress, his voice steady and purposeful. "I'm taking it one day at a time," he told me during one of these check-in calls. "That's what they teach you in NA. Don't think about staying clean forever, just focus on staying clean today." The recovery language was encouraging, suggesting that Kyle was finally taking addiction seriously as a disease that required ongoing management rather than something he could overcome through willpower alone. When he asked if David and I would like to have dinner with him at a family restaurant near our house, I agreed cautiously. The dinner went better than I'd dared to hope.
Kyle looked good, spoke thoughtfully about his experiences in prison and his plans for the future, and seemed genuinely interested in David's work and my career at Desert Hope. He asked intelligent questions about addiction treatment and recovery support services, displaying knowledge that suggested he'd been paying attention during his mandatory counseling sessions. "I want to make amends to you," Kyle said as we waited for dessert. "I know I put you through hell for years, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want to earn it back." The apology felt different from his previous attempts at making amends. It was specific rather than general, focused on the impact of his behavior rather than his intentions, and delivered without expectations of immediate forgiveness. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that Kyle might be serious about changing. But recovery is rarely linear, and Kyle's positive trajectory began to wobble after about 6 weeks. The calls became less frequent and more erratic. When he did call, he sounded either manic with enthusiasm about minor accomplishments or dejected about small setbacks that he described as major crises. "The manager at the restaurant is giving me a hard time," he complained during one late evening call. "He scheduled me for doubles 3 days in a row, and when I asked for a day off, he acted like I was being lazy." "What did you tell him?" I asked, trying to determine whether Kyle's perception of the situation was accurate. "I told him I needed time for my meetings. NA meetings are part of my parole requirements, so legally he has to accommodate them." "How did he respond to that?" Kyle's voice took on the familiar edge that preceded his worst episodes. "He said if I can't handle the schedule, maybe restaurant work isn't for me, like he's looking for reasons to fire me." I made supportive noises while internally noting the paranoid quality of Kyle's interpretation. In my experience, employers who are genuinely trying to sabotage employees didn't usually announce their intentions so openly. More likely, Kyle was struggling with the demands of full-time work and projecting his frustration onto his management. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the following weeks. Kyle began missing shifts, claiming he was sick or that the scheduling system was confused. When he did show up for work, he was frequently late or unprepared, leading to increasingly serious disciplinary conversations with management. "They're setting me up to fail," Kyle told me during what would be our last normal conversation. "The whole system is rigged against people like me. Ex-cons don't get second chances, no matter what they tell you in prison." 2 weeks later, Kyle was fired from the restaurant job for excessive absenteeism and insubordination. He was evicted from the halfway house the same week for violating curfew and failing a random drug test. Carmen called me in tears to deliver the news, her voice breaking as she described finding Kyle sleeping in his car behind a Circle K near her trailer. "He's using again," she sobbed into the phone. "He looks terrible, Rebecca. Skinny and dirty and broken." The familiar weight of Kyle's crisis settled over our family like a suffocating blanket. Carmen wanted to let him move back into her trailer, but I knew from bitter experience that enabling his addiction would only prolong his suffering. When she asked me to talk to him, to convince him to enter another treatment program, I felt the old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But this time, instead of immediately springing into action to manage Kyle's latest disaster, I took a deep breath and made a conscious choice to maintain the boundaries I'd spent years learning to establish. "Ma, I can't fix this for Kyle. Neither can you." "But he's your brother," Carmen pleaded, using the same argument that had controlled my behavior for decades. "And I love him," I replied. "But love doesn't mean sacrificing our own well-being for someone who isn't ready to get help." The conversation ended with Carmen hanging up on me, but I knew I'd made the right decision. Kyle's recovery had to be his choice, pursued for his own reasons rather than to please family members or avoid consequences.
3 days later, Kyle showed up at Desert Hope during my afternoon counseling sessions, demanding to see me. The receptionist, trained to handle difficult situations, calmly explained that I was with clients and offered to schedule an appointment for later in the week.
I don't need an appointment, Kyle said, his voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls of the counseling offices. She's my sister. I need to talk to her now. Security was called, and Kyle was escorted from the building after refusing to leave voluntarily. Dr. Williamson called me into her office that evening to discuss the incident and its potential impact on my work at the facility. I'm concerned about the boundaries between your personal and professional life, she said carefully. Kyle's behavior today created a disruption that affected other clients and staff members. I understand, I replied, feeling the familiar shame that accompanied Kyle's public outbursts. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. How do you plan to do that? The question hung in the air between us, laden with implications about my future at Desert Hope and my family's ongoing dysfunction. For the first time, I realized that Kyle's addiction wasn't just destroying his life anymore. It was threatening to destroy mine as well. The weeks following Kyle's disruption at Desert Hope brought an uncomfortable new reality into sharp focus. For the first time in our relationship, David began showing signs of strain that even his patient nature couldn't entirely mask. I'd catch him staring at his phone with a worried expression, or notice the way he tensed whenever my ringtone sounded in the evening. "Are you expecting another crisis call?" he asked one night as we sat on our back patio, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I'm always expecting another crisis call," I admitted. "That's been my normal for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to just relax." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his beer bottle in a rhythm that betrayed his agitation. "Rebecca, I need to say something, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way." My stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety that preceded difficult conversations about Kyle. "What is it?" "I'm starting to resent your brother," David said carefully. "Not just for what he does to you and your mother, but for what he's doing to us, to our marriage." The words hit me like cold water, shocking in their honesty and devastating in their accuracy. "David, I've been setting boundaries. I didn't bail him out. I didn't let him stay here. I didn't even talk to him when he showed up at my work." "I know," David said, reaching for my hand, "and I'm proud of you for that. But the boundaries you've set don't seem to be stopping Kyle from disrupting our lives. He's still calling at all hours, still showing up places he shouldn't be, still creating drama that follows you everywhere." The truth in his words was undeniable. Despite my best efforts to detach from Kyle's chaos, his addiction continued to cast a shadow over every aspect of my life. Even when I wasn't actively enabling his behavior, I was still emotionally consumed by it, still jumping every time my phone rang, still carrying the weight of his choices on my shoulders. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew what I was afraid to hear. "I'm saying that Kyle's problems can't be the third person in our marriage anymore. We need to find a way to protect what we've built together, or we're going to lose it." That night, I lay awake long after David had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and considering options I'd never allowed myself to think about before. What would it look like to truly cut Kyle out of my life? Was it possible to maintain a relationship with Carmen while refusing to engage with Kyle's drama? And most importantly, was I willing to risk losing my brother forever to save my marriage? The answer came 3 days later when Kyle appeared at our front door at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. David and I were getting ready for bed when the doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive pounding that made our windows rattle. "Rebecca!" Kyle's voice carried through the door, slurred and desperate. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." David and I froze in our bedroom, listening as Kyle continued his assault on our front door. The pounding grew more violent, punctuated by shouted demands that I come outside and face him like an adult. "I'm calling the police," David whispered, reaching for his phone. "Wait," I said, though I wasn't sure why. Some deeply ingrained part of me still felt responsible for managing Kyle's outbursts, for protecting him from the consequences of his behavior, even when those consequences were entirely deserved. "Rebecca, he's drunk and he's getting more aggressive,"
David said firmly. "This isn't a family discussion anymore. This is a domestic disturbance."
Before I could respond, we heard the sound of glass breaking. Kyle had apparently thrown something at our living room window, creating a spider web of cracks that would require expensive replacement. David's jaw tightened with an anger I'd rarely seen from him. "That's it," he said, dialing 911. "I don't care if he's your brother. He just vandalized our property." As David spoke to the emergency dispatcher, I found myself faced with a choice that crystallized everything I'd been struggling with for months. I could rush outside to try to calm Kyle down, to minimize the situation and protect him from arrest. Or I could stay inside and let the police handle a situation that had already escalated beyond family intervention. For the first time in my adult life, I chose to protect myself and my marriage over protecting Kyle's from consequences. The police arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights strobing across our neighborhood and drawing concerned neighbors to their windows. I watched from behind our damaged window as 2 officers approached Kyle, who was sitting on our front steps with his head in his hands. The conversation was brief and professional. Kyle didn't resist when they placed him in handcuffs, his earlier aggression apparently exhausted by his outburst. As they led him to their patrol car, he looked up at our house with an expression of such profound betrayal that it nearly broke my resolve. "Becca," he called out as they helped him into the back seat. "How could you let them arrest me? I'm your brother!" But I didn't answer. Instead, I closed the blinds and let David hold me while I cried for the relationship that was finally, irrevocably broken. The police report listed the charges as criminal damage to property and disorderly conduct. Kyle spent the night in county jail and was released the following afternoon with a court date and a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of our house or my workplace. Carmen called me that evening, her voice thick with disappointment and accusation. "How could you have him arrested? He's sick, Rebecca. He needs help, not jail." "He broke our window, Ma. He was drunk and threatening, and David was scared." "David was scared of Kyle?" Carmen's voice carried disbelief, as if the idea that Kyle could be genuinely intimidating was incomprehensible to her. "Kyle is 6 feet tall and was throwing things at our house at 11 o'clock at night. Of course David was scared. I was scared too." "You used to be able to talk him down," Carmen said, her tone suggesting that my failure to manage Kyle's outburst was somehow a personal failing rather than evidence of his escalating behavior. "I'm not Kyle's emotional therapist anymore, and I'm not going to sacrifice my marriage to manage his addiction." The conversation ended with Carmen hanging up on me for the second time in a month, leaving me sitting in my damaged living room and questioning everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and unconditional love. Dr. Williamson called me into her office the next morning, her expression serious as she gestured for me to take a seat across from her desk. "I heard about the incident at your house last night. How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I said automatically, then corrected myself. "Actually, I'm not okay. I'm exhausted and confused, and I feel like I'm failing everyone who matters to me." "Tell me more about that." For the next hour, I poured out everything I'd been holding inside about Kyle's addiction, my family's dysfunction, and the impossible position I'd been placed in as the only person willing to set boundaries. Dr. Williamson listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. "Rebecca," she said when I'd finished, "I want you to consider something. What if Kyle's behavior last night wasn't a crisis you failed to prevent, but rather a natural consequence of the boundaries you finally started to maintain?" The question reframed everything I'd been thinking about the incident. Instead of viewing Kyle's escalation as evidence that my new approach wasn't working, Dr. Williamson was suggesting it might be proof that it was working too well for Kyle's comfort.
Addicts often escalate their behavior when their usual manipulation tactics stop being effective. Kyle showing up at your house wasn't about getting help. It was about testing whether you'd abandon your boundaries when he raised the stakes high enough. And I didn't, I said slowly, the realization dawning. No, you didn't. You chose to protect yourself and your marriage instead of protecting Kyle from consequences. That's enormous progress. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Williamson helping me understand that my guilt about Kyle's arrest was misplaced. I hadn't failed him by refusing to enable his behavior. I'd finally succeeded in treating him like the adult he was, capable of making choices and living with the consequences.
But the most significant revelation came 3 days later, when I received a call from Maria Santos, a social worker at the county jail. Kyle had requested that she contact me about participating in a family therapy session as part of his court-mandated substance abuse evaluation. "Your brother seems genuinely motivated to address his addiction this time," Maria explained. "He's asking about long-term residential treatment options and expressing willingness to participate in family counseling if you're open to it." The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd begged Kyle to take his addiction seriously, to consider treatment options beyond the minimum required by the court system. Now, after I'd finally stopped begging, stopped enabling, and stopped protecting him from consequences, he was suddenly interested in recovery. "What kind of treatment is he considering?" I asked, surprised by my own curiosity. "There's a program called New Horizons in Flagstaff," Maria said. "It's a 6-month residential facility that specializes in treating people with multiple addiction-related arrests. They have a strong track record with clients who failed previous treatment attempts." I knew about New Horizons from my work at Desert Hope. It was expensive, intensive, and had strict requirements for admission and completion. More importantly, it was far enough from Phoenix to remove Kyle from his usual triggers and drug connections. "What would family therapy involve?" I asked. "Initially, it would be sessions between you and Kyle with a licensed family therapist. The focus would be on repairing damaged relationships and establishing healthy communication patterns, but participation would be entirely voluntary on your part." After hanging up with Maria, I sat in my office staring at the phone and trying to process this unexpected development. For the first time in years, Kyle was asking for help rather than demanding rescue. He was expressing willingness to participate in real treatment rather than just going through the motions to satisfy legal requirements. But I was also acutely aware that Kyle had made similar promises before, usually when facing serious legal consequences that motivated temporary commitment to change. How could I know whether this time was different? That evening, I discussed the situation with David over dinner, laying out the details of Kyle's treatment request and my own conflicted feelings about whether to participate. "What does your gut tell you?" David asked. "My gut tells me to be cautiously optimistic, but not to get my hopes up," I admitted. "Kyle's facing real prison time if he violates probation again. That might be enough motivation to make him serious about recovery." "And what does your training tell you?" I considered the question carefully. As a professional addiction counselor, I knew that family involvement often improved treatment outcomes, but only when family members could maintain appropriate boundaries and realistic expectations. My training tells me that if I participate in family therapy, I need to go in with clear goals and firm boundaries. It can't be an opportunity to try to fix Kyle or manage his recovery. It has to be about healing our relationship, not about getting him clean. David nodded thoughtfully. "And are you ready for that? To focus on healing the relationship without taking responsibility for his sobriety?" The question hung in the air between us, laden with implications about my own recovery from codependency and enabling behavior. For the first time since Kyle's arrest, I felt a spark of genuine hope mixed with realistic caution. "I think I might be," I said finally, "but I want to talk to Margaret about it first.
and maybe get some guidance from Dr. Williamson about how to approach family therapy with appropriate boundaries. 2 weeks later, after careful consideration and consultation with my support network, I made the decision to participate in Kyle's family therapy sessions. But this time, I entered the process with clear goals and firm boundaries that prioritized my own healing over Kyle's recovery. The first session was scheduled for the following month after Kyle completed his initial assessment at New Horizons. As I marked the date on my calendar, I realized that I was approaching this opportunity with a fundamentally different mindset than I'd brought to previous attempts to help Kyle. For the first time, I wasn't trying to save him. I was trying to save myself. The transformation in my thinking represented more than just a change in strategy. It was a complete shift in how I understood my role in Kyle's life and his role in mine. Instead of viewing myself as responsible for his recovery, I was finally ready to focus on my own healing from years of trauma and codependency. But as I prepared for this new chapter in our relationship, I had no way of knowing that Kyle's most destructive episode was still ahead of us, or that the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish would be tested in ways I couldn't imagine.
The real test of my recovery from enabling behavior was approaching, and it would arrive at the most vulnerable moment possible, during a celebration of my marriage that Kyle would refuse to let proceed in peace. The transformation at Meridian that night revealed layers of calculation I hadn't recognized during the actual crisis. Patricia Lawson, the restaurant manager, sat across from me in her office 2 days later, a manila folder spread open between us containing what she called Kyle's incident history. "Your brother first appeared here 6 weeks ago," Patricia explained, pointing to a dated entry in the file. "He came in during lunch rush asking if we took reservations for Martinez. When our hostess confirmed we had upcoming reservations under that name, he became agitated and had to be escorted out." The revelation sent chills down my spine. Kyle hadn't randomly chosen Meridian for his anniversary disruption. He'd been systematically visiting our favorite restaurants, gathering intelligence about our dining plans so he could maximize the impact of his interference. 2 weeks later, he returned during evening service, Patricia continued, flipping to another report. This time, he was clearly intoxicated and claimed he was meeting family for dinner. When we couldn't locate any reservation under his name, he became belligerent and accused our staff of discrimination. I stared at the documented evidence of Kyle's premeditation, each incident building toward the culmination I'd witnessed firsthand. This wasn't addiction-driven desperation. It was calculated harassment designed to punish me for establishing boundaries he refused to respect. "The third incident occurred just last week," Patricia said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Kyle entered through our bar area and attempted to access our reservation system by claiming he needed to confirm details for his sister's anniversary dinner. Our bartender, Miguel, recognized him from the previous incidents and immediately alerted security." "He was planning this for over a month," I said, the full scope of Kyle's manipulation finally becoming clear. "Which is why we called the police preemptively that night," Patricia confirmed. "We'd already established protocols for handling Kyle Martinez should he return. Our staff had clear instructions to contact authorities immediately rather than attempting to de-escalate." The meeting with Patricia reframed everything I thought I understood about Kyle's relapse and subsequent behavior. He hadn't simply fallen back into old patterns of addiction-driven chaos. He'd deliberately crafted a campaign of psychological warfare against my marriage, timing his most destructive episode to coincide with our most meaningful celebration. That evening, I shared Patricia's revelations with David as we sat in our living room, the replacement window we'd installed after Kyle's previous outburst, serving as a reminder of how far his behavior had escalated. "He studied us," David said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That's exactly what we were," I replied, the truth settling over me with uncomfortable clarity. When Kyle realized that traditional manipulation wasn't working anymore, he shifted to intimidation and sabotage. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Kyle's calculated harassment.
When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made me understand how close we'd come to losing everything we'd built together. Rebecca, I need you to understand something. If you had rushed out to protect Kyle that night, if you had made excuses for his behavior or asked me to drop the charges, I don't think our marriage would have survived. The honesty in his statement was both shocking and clarifying. I'd been so focused on my own journey toward healthy boundaries that I hadn't fully grasped how Kyle's behavior had affected David's trust in our relationship. I wouldn't have protected him, I said, though part of me wondered if that was entirely true. I've learned too much about enabling myself to go back to those patterns. Have you? David asked gently. Because when Kyle grabbed that maitre d's' arm, I saw you tense up like you were about to intervene. Some part of you is still wired to rescue him, even when he's clearly the aggressor. The observation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Despite years of therapy and boundary setting, my instinct to protect Kyle from consequences remained strong. The difference was that I'd finally developed the self-awareness to recognize that instinct and choose a different response. 3 days later, Kyle called me from county jail. His voice subdued, but lacking the desperate edge I'd grown accustomed to during his previous arrests. "I suppose you're not going to bail me out this time either," he said without preamble. "No," I replied simply. "I'm not." "Good," Kyle said, surprising me. "Because I don't want you to."
The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had during his previous legal troubles. Kyle spoke with a clarity that suggested he was sober and clear-headed about his situation for the first time in months. "Becca, I need you to know that what happened at your anniversary dinner wasn't a relapse," he said. "I mean, I was high, obviously, but the decision to go there, to ruin your night, that was planned. I was angry about the boundaries you'd set, and I wanted to punish you for them." The admission was both devastating and liberating. For years, I'd made excuses for Kyle's behavior by attributing it to his disease, his trauma, his inability to control himself when under the influence. Learning that his most hurtful actions had been deliberate forced me to confront the reality that Kyle wasn't just sick, he was also capable of conscious cruelty. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to stop feeling guilty about cutting me off," Kyle replied. "You deserve better than what I've put you through, and David deserves better than having a brother-in-law who actively tries to destroy his marriage." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Kyle acknowledging specific ways he'd manipulated our family over the years and expressing genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. But what struck me most was his acceptance of responsibility without any corresponding request for forgiveness or reconciliation. "I'm going to plead guilty to the charges," Kyle said as our call ended. "Assault, disorderly conduct, violation of the restraining order, all of it. I'm done fighting the consequences." "What does that mean for your sentence?" "Probably 18 to 24 months in state prison, which is exactly what I deserve." After hanging up with Kyle, I sat in my office at Desert Hope and contemplated the strange mix of emotions his call had generated. Relief that he was finally taking responsibility for his actions, sadness that our relationship had deteriorated to the point where honesty felt like a farewell, and surprisingly, a sense of closure that I hadn't expected to find. Dr. Williamson knocked on my office door an hour later, her expression concerned as she settled into the chair across from my desk. "How are you processing Kyle's arrest and the anniversary incident?" she asked. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "For the first time, I don't feel responsible for fixing his problems or managing his consequences." "That's significant progress," Dr. Williamson said. "But I want to check in about something else. How is this affecting your work here at Desert Hope?" The question had been weighing on my mind since Kyle's arrest made local news, his charges serious enough to warrant a brief mention in the Phoenix area crime reports. Several clients had asked if the Kyle Martinez mentioned in the news was related to me, forcing me to navigate questions about my personal life during therapy sessions. "I'm concerned about maintaining professional boundaries," I told Dr. Williamson honestly. "Some clients seem to view my family situation as either inspiring or disqualifying, depending on their own perspectives about addiction and family relationships." "How are you planning to handle those reactions?"
by being transparent about my experience without making it the focus of their treatment. My understanding of addiction comes partly from personal experience, but each client's journey is unique. Dr. Williamson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. Your lived experience is an asset in this work, but only if you can maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The conversation helped me understand that Kyle's behavior had tested not just my personal boundaries, but also my professional identity. Successfully maintaining both sets of boundaries during his crisis felt like validation of all the work I'd done to separate my role as a family member from my role as an addiction counselor. 2 weeks later, David and I returned to Meridian for what we decided to call our anniversary do-over. Patricia greeted us warmly and seated us at the same table where Kyle had disrupted our original celebration. "How does it feel to be back?" David asked as we settled into our seats. "Like reclaiming something that was taken from us," I said, looking around the dining room where I had finally chosen my marriage over my brother's chaos. The evening proceeded peacefully, without crisis calls or family drama. We talked about our future plans, discussed the possibility of starting a family, and celebrated not just our marriage, but my growth towards healthier family relationships. As we left the restaurant that night, David took my hand and asked a question that crystallized everything we'd been through together. "Do you think Kyle will ever get better?" I considered the question carefully, drawing on both my professional knowledge and my personal experience with my brother's patterns of behavior.
I think Kyle will get better when he decides he wants to be better for his own reasons, I said finally. Not to please family, not to avoid consequences, but because he's tired of being the person he's become. And do you think that will happen? I hope so, I admitted, but I'm not going to sacrifice my life waiting for it to happen. Walking to our car hand in hand, I realized that Kyle's attempt to destroy our anniversary had actually strengthened our marriage by forcing me to demonstrate my commitment to protecting what we'd built together. His calculation had backfired, revealing his true intentions while simultaneously proving that I'd finally developed the strength to choose my own happiness over his dysfunction. The anniversary Kyle that tried to ruin became the night I fully embraced my right to prioritize my marriage, my peace, and my future over my family's past patterns of chaos and manipulation. 1 year after Kyle's sentencing to 2 years in state prison, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at Arizona State University, delivering a keynote speech about family recovery from addiction. The invitation had come from the social work department, where my former professors wanted me to share insights about maintaining professional boundaries while navigating personal experience with substance abuse. Recovery isn't just about the person using drugs, I told the audience of students, professionals, and family members. It's about everyone in the family system learning to break patterns that enable destructive behavior. In the front row, Carmen sat with tears in her eyes. Our relationship had been strained for months after Kyle's arrest, with her struggling to understand how I could abandon my brother when he needed help most. It had taken intensive family counseling for both of us to recognize that my boundaries weren't abandonment. They were the first healthy response our family had ever had to Kyle's addiction. My mother and I learned that love without limits isn't actually love. It's enabling. Real love sometimes means allowing people to face consequences so they can find motivation to change. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with trembling hands and tears streaming down her face. "My brother is exactly like yours," she whispered. "I've been bailing him out for 3 years, and it's destroying my marriage. How do you stop feeling guilty?" The question transported me back to my own journey, remembering the crushing weight of guilt that had accompanied every boundary I'd set, every rescue I had refused to provide. The guilt never completely disappears, I told her honestly, but you learn to recognize it as a sign that you're doing something new and necessary, not something wrong. I gave her my business card and Margaret Foster's contact information, knowing that her recovery from codependency would require the same kind of support system that had saved my marriage and my sanity. David found me in the parking lot afterward, his pride evident in the way he looked at me. "5 years ago, you would never have been able to give that speech," he said, pulling me into his arms.
5 years ago, I was still trying to save Kyle instead of saving myself, I replied, feeling the weight of how far we'd both traveled. Our marriage had emerged from Kyle's crisis stronger than either of us had imagined possible. The boundaries I'd learned to set with my family had translated into healthier communication patterns in all my relationships. David and I started couples counseling 6 months after Kyle's arrest, not because we were in crisis, but because we wanted to ensure that the growth we'd experienced would continue. I used to think that loving someone meant being willing to sacrifice anything for them, I told our therapist during one session. Now I understand that healthy love requires protecting yourself so you can show up as your best self. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Carmen had required her own therapy to understand how her enabling behavior had prolonged Kyle's addiction rather than helping him. She joined a Families Anonymous group and slowly learned to redirect her caregiving energy towards healthier pursuits. I thought being a good mother meant never giving up on my children, she told me during one of our monthly dinners. But I see now that I was giving up on you by expecting you to sacrifice your life for Kyle's problems. Kyle himself had been surprisingly supportive of my decision to maintain distance during his incarceration. His letters, which arrived monthly, contained none of the manipulation or guilt-inducing language that had characterized his previous communications from jail. Instead, he wrote about the vocational training programs he was completing, the therapy groups he attended, and his realistic assessment of the work recovery would require. "I'm not asking you to trust me or welcome me back into your life when I get out," he wrote in one particularly thoughtful letter. "I understand that trust is earned through consistent behavior over time, and I haven't earned anything yet. I just want you to know that I'm finally doing this work for me, not for anyone else." The maturity in his communication was encouraging, but I'd learned to not build expectations around Kyle's promises. Recovery was a daily choice, and only time would reveal whether his apparent growth was genuine or simply another phase in his ongoing struggle.
My career at Desert Hope flourished as my personal boundaries strengthened. Dr. Williamson promoted me to clinical supervisor, recognizing that my combination of professional training and lived experience made me particularly effective at helping other family members navigate similar challenges. Your story gives people hope that recovery is possible for entire families, not just the person using drugs, she explained during my performance review. But more importantly, you model what healthy boundaries look like in practice. The promotion allowed me to develop specialized programming for family members of people in addiction, creating workshops and support groups that addressed the specific trauma and enabling patterns that emerge in these relationships. The program became so successful that other treatment centers began requesting training materials and consultation. 6 months after my promotion, David and I received news that would have terrified us during the chaos of Kyle's active addiction. I was pregnant. The pregnancy had been planned and wanted, but it forced us to confront questions about Kyle's potential role in our child's life. "What if he's genuinely different when he gets out?" David asked as we sat in our doctor's office looking at ultrasound images of our daughter. "Then we'll reassess our boundaries based on his actual behavior, not his promises," I replied. "But our first responsibility is protecting our family." We spent considerable time in therapy discussing how to handle Kyle's eventual release and potential request for a relationship with his niece. The conversations were complex, requiring us to balance cautious optimism with protective realism. Recovery is measured in years, not months, our therapist reminded us. Kyle will need to demonstrate sustained sobriety and emotional stability before you consider including him in your daughter's life. Carmen, meanwhile, had become an unexpected ally in maintaining healthy boundaries. Her own work in therapy had helped her understand that protecting my growing family from potential chaos wasn't rejection of Kyle, it was responsible parenting. "I want to be a grandmother who provides stability, not drama," she told me during one visit, her hands resting on my growing belly. "That means supporting the boundaries you set, even when they're hard for me to accept." Kyle's release date was scheduled for 6 months after our daughter's birth.
As that date approached, I found myself experiencing a complex mix of emotions. Hope that he had genuinely changed, anxiety about protecting my family, and a new kind of love that had nothing to do with obligation or guilt. The love I felt for my daughter was pure and protective, uncomplicated by years of manipulation and enabling. It helped me understand the difference between healthy family bonds and the toxic enmeshment that had characterized my relationship with Kyle. I want her to grow up knowing that love includes boundaries, I told David as we prepared the nursery, that caring for someone doesn't mean accepting destructive behavior. On the day our daughter Emma was born, I held her in my arms and made a silent promise that she would never be asked to sacrifice her well-being for someone else's dysfunction. She would learn early that her worth wasn't dependent on managing other people's emotions or solving other people's problems. Margaret Foster, my Al-Anon sponsor, visited us in the hospital and offered wisdom that crystallized everything I'd learned about family, love, and recovery. The greatest gift you can give Emma is your own emotional health, she said, holding my newborn daughter with the tenderness of someone who understood the preciousness of new beginnings. Children learn more from what they see than what they're told. As I looked at Emma's perfect face, I realized that Kyle's attempt to destroy my anniversary actually saved my family's future. His calculated cruelty had forced me to choose between enabling his dysfunction and protecting my marriage, leading to growth that would benefit not just David and me, but the generations that followed. The anniversary Kyle tried to ruin became the foundation for a legacy of healthy boundaries, authentic love, and the radical idea that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction. Emma would grow up in a family where love was expressed through respect, support, and appropriate limits, not through endless rescuing and enabling. That was Kyle's unexpected gift to us all, forcing me to learn the difference between love and codependency before I had the chance to pass those patterns on to my daughter.
Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.